In our journey through Kings, through 1 Kings, we met the demise of Solomon last week. So Solomon's idolatry found him out, and God let him know that the kingdom was going to be torn away from him. And at the end of chapter 11, it was written that Solomon died, passed away, and that the kingdom was handed off to his son, Rehoboam. And as we enter into chapter 12 this morning, we're going to read the first 24 verses together. And we're going to see what Rehoboam is all about and how the start to his reign over Israel is. So, if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to 1 Kings chapter 12. If you don't, no worries at all. We will have it on the screen so you can follow along. This is what the text says. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. Shechem was a town north of Jerusalem. It was a place that kings were often crowned. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, if you remember, Jeroboam was the one who had been a worker for Solomon, who God prophesied through his prophet that he was going to take control over 10 of the kingdoms, and then there was strife between Solomon and Jeroboam, so he went down to Egypt, if you remember that from last week. So when Jeroboam, I say that because we've got Rehoboam and Jeroboam, so it's the Boam brothers, right? Except they're not brothers. So there's a word in Hebrew, yam. That's our anglicized Boam here. It's yam in Hebrew. It means people, and so we'll talk about the meaning of their name in just a minute. Well, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this. He was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us. But now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we'll serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days, and then come back to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. And they replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. And he asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your fathers put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him replied, "These people have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Now you tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid a heavy yoke on you, but I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I'll scourge you with scorpions." 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king answered the people harshly. Rejecting the advice given to him by the elders, he followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I'll scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor. But all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel had been in rebellion against the house of David. Israel has been in rebellion to the house of David to this day. Of course, meaning the day that this book was written. When all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered all Judah and the tribes of Benjamin, 180,000 able young men, to go to war against Israel and to regain the kingdom for Rehoboam, son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. Say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says. Do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again, as the Lord had ordered. Word of God for the people of God. So we have in this moment the very beginning of the reign of King Rehoboam. The Hebrew named Rehoboam. It's two words, Rehab, Yam. Rehab Yam. It means wide or many people. So the people are wide or many. Incredibly ironic, because under the leadership of King Rehoboam, his grasp on the people is going to shrink. So he becomes king. He's anointed king at Shechem. But the people of all Israel have one simple request for him. And the request is, hey, listen, your dad was great and all, but working for him, it kind of stunk. In fact, he was pretty harsh on us, and it was challenging. And all we're asking for from you, all we want from you, is a promise that you will ease the burden or the harshness on us. And Rehoboam says, give me 3 days to think about it. Ultimately, because he wants to consult and get some advice on all of this and come back to the people. Interesting, isn't it? The imagery that's used here. They talk about the yoke that your father has put on us. Excuse me. The yoke, of course, is this, I don't know if yokes are still used. I imagine they're still used somewhere in the world. But a yoke was a strong piece of wood with separate holes in it that connected beasts of burden together so they could do heavy work for their owner. And typically a beast of burden that was kind of worn in and used to the work would be attached to a more wild and less tame one, so it would help that one kind of learn the way. It was also, this word used of slaves who had yokes put on them in the slave market. And so there's this language of people, Israelites, being treated or identified as slaves or animals when this word yoke is used. Becomes super significant. In other words, they understood that Solomon's view of them was this is who they were. Yikes. And so they say, we need it to be different, and we will happily serve you as our king. So Solomon goes off and gets advice from several different people, and he comes back, and his decision, crazily, is, in fact, I'm not only not going to make it easier for you, I'm actually going to make it harder and harsher for you. Stunning. And of course, this leads to what God had prophesied through the prophet, that the kingdom is going to be divided at this moment and ripped from the hands of Rehoboam. This man who's a king named the people are many is going to be leading over just a few. And listen to what the people say to him in a little poetic moment, right? If you have the Bible in front of you, that little section there is kind of written in indented fashion because it's ancient Hebrew poetry. It's as if they sang to him in a song their emotive feelings, right? And of course, this was the common way for people to or at least to record the kind of emotive functions of people in the ancient world. And they say to him, we have no part in David. What does that mean? Well, the Hebrew word that's translated part here means inheritance, right? We have no inheritance in David. And so what they're saying, of course, in the Old Testament, this word inheritance is a loaded word. It's significant because an inheritance is what God has promised his people. So the inheritance is the full life experience in the land of God's blessing with God there. And they're saying that we're not sharing in that experience because of how you're treating us. In essence, they're saying, we aren't your brothers and sisters, we're your slaves or your beasts of burden. And so they turn in a wildly rebellious moment and say, we're going to anoint our own king. And so they do. And for a short time, there are two competing kings of Israel, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam, who was anointed because of his royal procession, and then Jeroboam, who was anointed because the people said, we're not serving this guy because of how he's treated and what he's decided about us. And of course, this leads to immediate, for lack of a better term, civil war, right? Immediate conflict. And by the end of verse 24, though, as the chapters and verses go on, there's going to be plenty of conflict that happens between the two spaces. You have a divided kingdom. Right? So, again, let's think geographically for a minute. I was going to put a picture on the screen, but I decided against it because I don't want to overdo it here. But if you can kind of picture what modern-day Israel looks like, and if you have trouble with that, I had a professor in Bible college who told me, you draw a tiny circle, you draw a line, you draw a bigger circle, right? So you've got the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. That is the eastern boundary of Israel. Now, of course, Israel extended above it. And then on the left, you draw a backward sea. That's the beach line to the Mediterranean Sea. And the stuff in between is kind of Israel. Well, right at the top of the Dead Sea and below is where the tribe of Judah resided, as well as the tribe of Benjamin. That now becomes Rehoboam's territory. And everything above it is now going to be led by Jeroboam. So 10 tribes to 2 tribes, and the kingdom is forever divided. Moving forward, you'll hear 2 names, Judah and Israel. Israel will always mean moving forward the northern kingdom, right? The 10 tribes led by Jeroboam and those who follow him. And Judah will always mean Judah plus Benjamin. I don't know why Benjamin kind of is, gets the short stick here, but and that's what's happening here. And there'll be continual strife over it. And we'll see this northern kingdom develop in the chapters that are ahead. But we want to really concern ourselves with this morning is, how does something like this happen? Right, we've been continuing to ask that question throughout. And how does Rehoboam make such a foolhardy decision in this moment? What leads him to that? And before we can jump into the movers and the things that make him do it, I really want to take some time and help you see the way the storyteller actually paints this story. I mean, any of us can look at this and say, this guy made a really bad decision. And really, that's all you need to know. But for our sake, to understand the fullness of it, I want to take some time and show you how the storyteller is actually developing a narrative irony that actually, for the Jewish reader or a thoughtful reader, would have saw this thing in stark colors and contrast. Because the foolhardiness of Rehoboam's sin in the eyes of the storyteller is that he has, instead of being a king of Israel, actually become much closer to a pharaoh of Egypt. Now, if you remember, this whole book of Kings is set in juxtaposition to the Exodus. We keep talking about this, and you say, okay, Adam, why does this even matter? Well, a couple of reasons it matters. One, because the Exodus is the identity story of the Jewish people. It's who they are is developed in that reality. And so for all of the scripture writers, through the Old Testament, straight through into the New Testament, because Jesus is going to lead a new Exodus, if you read the New Testament writers right, the Exodus is front and center for all of them. And so it is again in this chapter. Look at some of the things that happen in this chapter and reflect upon how close they mirror the Exodus story. You have a king or a leader who is oppressing a group of people, right? That's the story of Israel in slavery to Egypt. Problem is now it's Israel's own king who's doing it to them. And do you remember in the story of the Exodus, the people go through their leaders to Pharaoh and say, "Ease your burden on us." And what does Pharaoh do? He doubles down and makes it harder. You're going to make bricks without straw. You have this ironic juxtaposition going on here. Even when Rehoboam says, at the advice of his friends, that, well, my father used whips to make your life hard, I'm going to use scorpions. What a strange thing, right? I suppose a scorpion's worse than a whip, though a whip's pretty bad. Well, I think the word scorpion is used here because the other place that it's used in Scripture is in the book of Deuteronomy to speak about life in the wilderness. In other words, I'm going to make your life as challenging as those 40 years of wilderness journey. What a strong thing to say. And then you have, strangely enough, Jeroboam taking up a type of Moses. Do you see it? Jeroboam is coming up out of Egypt as the rescuer of his people. The name, we said the name Rehoboam means many or wide people. The name Yeroboam means contending for people. It's contending for his people, asking for their freedom and their liberation from this. And you have this strange reality of Israel needing a liberator from their own king. Wild. And do you remember the story in Exodus where Moses begins to come to grips with his who he is? Remember, he grows up in the court of Pharaoh, but he comes to realize his Jewish heritage. And do you remember he sees the slave master who's oppressing his people? And do you remember what he does to him? He kills him, right? It's what ends up getting him ejected from Egypt. Well, what strange little note do we have told in chapter 12 here? We meet Adoniram for no other reason but to hear he's a slave master who gets stoned by the Israelites. Same thing is going on there as well. And then, as Rehoboam tries to mount his army of 180,000 strong to take back his people, we get Red Sea imagery, don't we? A Pharaoh who relents and relinquishes, but then decides, I'm going to mount my armies and come after them. And he is stopped by God himself. In the very same way that we're told here, God moves the prophet to speak to the people, and he stops them. This is incredible storytelling, isn't it? Did you pick up on this stuff? What the storyteller is telling us is Rehoboam is Pharaoh. A crazy thing has happened. The very thing God needed to free his people from, the leader of his people has become. Wow. This is the horror and the hideousness of his sin. It is that rather than being a shepherd who serves his people, he has become a master who enslaves his people. And his people now need to turn to God to be liberated from their own. This is the story of sin, friends. It is easy for us to look at the worst of the worst in the world and say, they've got a problem. And unless we are being honest with the brokenness of our heart, we walk in danger of also becoming the worst of the worst. Who would have thought that a people who were identified by being rescued by God from the harshness of slavery would then raise up leaders who would do it to them? Amazing. So where does this come from? How does this happen? There's some interesting things that happen in this story. Some of them are, one of them at least, is PG-13. I think I'm going to rate it PG-13. It could go later than that. The Bible gets a little risque sometimes, and you'll see it today. And of course, what's going on here is the issue of pride, right? It's an ongoing theme throughout Kings. You say, we talked about pride 2 weeks ago, or last week, I forget which one it was. Yeah, get used to it. We're going to talk about it an awful lot, because as Solomon writes in Proverbs, pride comes before every fall. At the root of every sin or rebellion is pride. It exists there, and it is the reason for it. And we are meant to see a direct connection from Rehoboam to his dad, right? In other words, we see this story and we think, how could he do this? Well, this is all he's ever known, right? Remember that old don't do drugs commercial in the 80s or the 90s or whatever? Like, I learned it from watching you, Dad, right? I imagine this is what Rehoboam is saying right now. I learned it from watching you, Dad. And so like father, like son, pride goes before the fall. How would Rehoboam know to be harsh on his people? He watched his dad do that very thing, and yet he's going to take it a step further. Why? Because like any king grasping for power, he needs to make a name for himself. This is a moment in transition to step out of dad's shadow and demonstrate your own strength and lack of weakness. Show no mercy, show no weakness. How do we know this is part of what he's doing? Well, one, he doubles down and makes it harder. But two, there's this strange little saying in there. Did you catch it? It's really weird. Where the young men say to him, and then he repeats to the people, my little finger is thicker than my dad's waist. That is wildly his ability to do this. And if we were ancient Hebrews, we would see it loud and clear and said we all speak English, and we're like, my little finger is bigger than my dad's waist. That's weird. Yeah, it's actually much more risque and strong-worded than that. And Rehoboam saying, this is my chance to show the people what I'm worth, to make a name for myself, to show them my power and my significance. And how I'm going to do that is to inflict on them even greater pain than my father even did. Pride. Friends, think about your life and the times in which you get yourself into sticky situations. How often is it because you are either trying to make a name for yourself or maintain a name for yourself? When you trim the edges off the truth, or you envision something different than it is to better your circumstance, or you consider people less than you in a particular way. Pride is a tricky, tricky, tricky thing because it is equally subtle and equally sinister in all of our existence. And unless you are keenly aware of rooting it out, it will fester and it will make you do unthinkable things. You'll become more Pharaoh than Israelite. Now, my guess is you're not going around saying my little one is thicker than my dad's loins, right? But we have our own sayings in 2025 in the Western world that demonstrate who we are, right? We pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We make a name for ourselves. We don't need anybody's help. We can do it on our own. And we buy into all of these narratives, and they inform how we live our lives and the decisions that we make, rather than posturing ourselves as worshipers of God. That is, that Rehoboam had a moment to correct the error of his father by turning and offering glory to God, and instead just increase the glory on himself. My little one is thicker than my father's loins probably should have said, Yahweh is far greater than the whole of me. I serve him, and we follow after him. But Rehoboam's buying into the narratives of this world. So how does his pride get fanned into flame? Well, he listens to the wrong voices. Again, a major theme in the book of Kings, right? Solomon prays for a heart that hears God. And Rehoboam gets advice from the elders and from the young men. The word elders, of course, in Hebrew, it means older, more mature people. But it's certainly speaking about age, but much more speaking about experience in faith and obedience and following Yahweh, following God, following Torah. It's a word that Paul then uses in the New Testament to speak about leaders in the church. Again, emphasizing the very same thing. We have elders here at Hope, not because we think it's a cool name, but because the New Testament instructs us to do it. And these are people who have lived and walked with God for a significant amount of time, who have experienced both the struggles and the difficulties of this world and the glory of God, and have walked in obedience for a while, so that they can be looked to for guidance and in leadership. And of course, elders had been established in the people of God going all the way back to right after Moses receives the covenant from God. And so in all the tribes, then there are elders. And these are exactly the kind of people that Rehoboam should be asking. And strangely enough, they get it right. They say to him, here's what you should do. Serve the people instead of expecting them to serve you. Perfect advice. It says Rehoboam rejects it. The literal language is he walks away. Like, I'm not interested in that. Let me go talk to my buddies, right? And so he goes to the young men, which is in Hebrew literally translates to children. But it's meant to speak again of immaturity in faith and obedience, not to particular age. And what's more, it says these are the people that he grew up with, right? So I have a saying, it's not mine on own, but I talk about teen boy groupthink, right? You've all somewhat experienced that in your own life or your brother's life or your kid's life. I've now experienced that in all segments of my life. Teen boy groupthink, where they get together and come up together with some of the worst decisions you can ever imagine because collectively they have decided it without asking anyone for wisdom. I just talked to my sister the other day, and she let me know that my nephew got together with all of his friends, and they all decided they were going to give each other haircuts, right? Teen boy groupthink. Far less destructive than this one, but it really never ends well, you know? And so here we have Rehoboam doing teen boy groupthink about how he should rule as king. And they're like, here's what you should do. Double down. Make it harder. Tell him this. And he's like, you know what? That's a great idea. I'm going to do it. And we all look at this and go, what an idiot, right? What a loser, capital L, you know? And we don't stop and look at our lives. I mean, what voices are you listening to? Think with me for just a second, right? I'm not suggesting to you that you need to process everything with the elders of Hope Alliance Church, but you ought to have people in your life who are mature and who have walked with God for a time, who you can bounce ideas off, who you can talk to, they can pray with you and process with you, who know and love you and who know and love God and who know the dangers of this world and can navigate that with you. The Christian life has always been meant to be lived in a communal fashion, not an isolated fashion. Who are those people in your life? And then who are the young men in your life? Who are the people that give you teen boy groupthink, right? They're the people who look and think just like you, and you know the advice because it appeals to your pride, not to God's glory. It's super tempting. They tell you exactly what you want to hear. And because you've heard it from someone else, you're like, this has got to be it. And there are so many of those voices in our world today, and many of them are subtle, whether they're coming from music or from politicians or from colleagues or from just the subtle realities and beliefs of our Western world. that are constantly being piped into our heads. And my problem is, I don't think that we just say, I'm going to do that because they said that. I think we don't discern. We hear all these things and we're making decisions that we think are our own decisions, but we're actually depending upon younger men, teen boy groupthink, rather than elders. The major call of this chapter is, would you discern the voices that you are listening to? Are they pulling you closer to a worship and a glorification of God? Or are they appealing to your pride? Now listen, we can look at this story and be like, man, what a stupid thing. He listened to the wrong people. But there should be something even more striking in this moment than that. Do you know what it is? Who did he not seek? Oh, great, he talked to the elders. Terrific. There is no reference to Rehoboam seeking the face of God, going to God, asking to hear from God. Friends, great if you have people in your life who you trust, but if you are not taking their advice and bringing it to the feet of God and to the Scriptures, you also are in danger of listening to broken human vessels who may be well-intended, but equally could be wrong. His father had prayed to God for a heart that hears, and God gave it to him in spades. And apparently Solomon didn't relay that story to his son, or his son had forgotten. And there is no reference in this 3-day sojourn to the pursuit of the presence of God. Friends, in this life, if you are not making appropriate space to be in the presence of God, you are in danger. I'm not talking about these heightened experiential moments. They're great when they come along. I'm talking about the daily grind and routine of opening the Scriptures and reading them, of submitting yourself to God in prayer and asking Him for wisdom and guidance. What an incredible gift the Scriptures are to us. That God has seen fit to give us His counsel without us even asking for it. Amazing. And yet, for many of us, myself included, we go through most of our life undiscerning the voices that we're actually listening to, and rejecting, by walking away, not even the counsel of the elders, but the counsel of God Himself. How could Rehoboam make such a horrifically bad decision? It's kind of easy, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of obvious. One, his pride was uncontrolled. And when your pride is uncontrolled, pride trees produce pride fruit, right? Pride trees do not produce any other kind of fruit except pride fruit. Apple trees don't all of a sudden one day give you an orange. That's not how it works. And so if that's the tree that's growing in your life, that's the fruit that's being produced in your life. And if all the wisdom that you're receiving is voices that are watering and feeding that tree, that's what's growing. But if we begin to discern and to reject or set aside the counsel that would feed our pride, and instead seek out with intentionality the counsel that would feed our worshiping submission to God, we will see a very different kind of tree grow with a very different kind of fruit in our lives. His pride is uncontrolled because he's feeding it with what it wants to hear. Funny, isn't it? In our world, if we are not discerning, we will quickly become just the same way. In fact, the Apostle Paul warned his protege Timothy, who was a pastor in a church, that this very thing happens all the time. Listen what he says in 2 Timothy chapter 4. He says, "For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine," right? That is, wisdom that leads to worship. "Instead, to suit their own desires, to feed their pride, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear." There's a reason we listen to the voices we listen to, because they're telling us what we want to hear, even when it's not good for us. The folly of Rehoboam gives us ample opportunity to pause and think, oh my, what calamity or destruction awaits me if I do not begin discerning the voices that I'm listening to, if I do not get real about the pride problem in my life, which, oh, by the way, is problem number one for all of us. Right? But we would be remiss if we didn't pause and say, what a horrible existence it must have been for the people of Israel to live under such a king. That their identity had gone from freed slave who has become son, brother, to enslaved in harsh burden again. What a horrible existence. And all of this shows us, once again, that Rehoboam is not the ultimate or the rightful king. It couldn't be David. We learned after some hope it couldn't be Solomon. We know super quick it can't be Solomon's son either. And oh, by the way, we'll learn next week, it can't be Jeroboam either. He's going to turn into Aaron instead of Moses, making a golden calf. Crazy how this Exodus thing keeps happening. And all of it is meant to point us as readers and hearers of this story to a hope for an ultimate king who can finally come and offer us the peace and the rest and the life that we long for. Friends, the masters that we are serving in this world are harsh taskmasters. They are burdening us. They are tiring us. They are using us for our productivity and our performance and giving us an identity on it. And Jesus, the rightful king, says just the opposite. He says, "Come to me, any who are heavily burdened, and I will give you a yoke, but one that is light and easy. In fact, I will give you not just rest for your body," he says, "but rest for your soul." We think of that word soul as that immaterial part of us that lives forever. That's probably more Plato than New Testament. Right? The soul is our life source, our essence, who we are in the core. That is, this is rest that goes into the very core of us. It's not just a well-deserved weekend off. It is a fullness of life that is utterly sustaining, even in the harshest of circumstances in this world. And it is only achieved by being yoked to the right master, Jesus. Is he meant to tame us? 1,000%. But in the path that leads to life, in an identity that is found by our union to him, not our performance for him. Jesus performs, we need not. But he shows us what true life is like, and in so doing, gives us final rest. You know what the Old Testament calls rest? Life in the promised land. The story of 1 Kings is a life in the promised land that fails to be rest. And Jesus says, I've come to fulfill all of the promises. What master are you serving in this world? You need not be enslaved to them. Now, I'm not saying you can necessarily quit your job or pick a different family or whatever it is, but you need not be enslaved to it. And those who are telling you it are whispering lies to you, because your identity is not found in your performance. It is not found in your productivity. It's not found in what you can do or what you can make of yourself. All lies that never bring rest. But if you find an identity fully proclaimed and embraced in the work of Christ for you, you are liberated from the lies of the taskmasters of this world. This is what our true and rightful King offers us. So this morning, as we reflect on 1 Kings chapter 12, a few things to take away. One, are you conscious of the pride that entangles you? Two, are you discerning of the voices that you are listening to? But three, and most important, are you serving and yoked to the right master, the true King?